Right, in this video we're going to look at 2.2 planes and axes of movement. Now it's slightly confusing, planes and axes. A plane is kind of, if you think of a sheet of glass going through the body and we move along the plane. So if the sheet of glass goes through our body front to back, then the movement is in a forward and backwards direction. An axis is what we rotate around. So if you can imagine like a table football where there's the metal pole goes through the hips of the players, it goes from hip side to side, and when we spin around that axis, the movement is actually forwards and backwards. And what we're going to use a term is called perpendicular. So the axis is always perpendicular to the plane of movement, which means it works at 90-degree angles. For the silver, what we need to look at for the slightly higher one is when we're looking at the planes and axes of movement, we need to know particularly which movements, so flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, which plane and axis they work around. And then we need to be able to give sporting examples that will be expected maybe in the exam. Okay, so the three planes we need to know about is firstly the sagittal plane. We have the horizontal plane and then the frontal plane. So if we take the sagittal plane first, we can see that that's dividing the body to left and right. So it's going through the body. When we move along the sagittal plane, that would create a forward and backwards movement. So if we think of that plane as being kind of an arrow to direct the movement. So when we're flexing and extending, we're working on the sagittal plane. If you look at the horizontal plane, as its name suggests, it goes through the body horizontally, so it separates the body into top and the bottom. Now, when we move along that plane, it's a twisty rotation type movement, so an ice dancer pirouetting. And then the frontal plane separates our bodies into front and back. And if we move along that plane, our arms and our legs are moving out to the side, so things like abduction and adduction. Now, when we look at the axes, if we go back to the sagittal plane, the frontal axis is one that would go from the hip, through the hip, out of the other hip. So it would work 90 degrees, so very much like a table footballer. So we need to link the sagittal plane with the frontal axis. And if we had an axis of rotation going through there, if we spun that axis, it would cause like a somersaulting motion or a flexion extension type movement. The horizontal plane works on what's called the vertical axis, and that's an axis that goes from the head all the way through the body down to the toes. So if you think of the old style jewellery boxes where you lift it up and the ballerina spins around, or an ice dancer pirouetting. So if you put an axis through there and spun the person, then they're going to turn around in a twisty motion. And then the frontal plane actually works on the sagittal axis, which travels through the body, through the belly button and out the back. So again, if we put a javelin through the person's belly button and spun them, they would be doing a cartwheel type motion or abduction and adduction. So that's an explanation of how the planes and the axes work together and the kind of movements you've got. Once again, as we said before, is you've got to click to the textbook here and then other place that you can go and find information in the resources section of this resource. Now, what I suggest that you do is maybe create a table that says if this plane works, this is the axes, and then going back to the movements that we studied in the previous chapter, see if you can link which movement occurs in each plane. So the movements you need to know for GCSE PE are flexion, extension, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, abduction, adduction, and rotation. And see if you can link in which one moves on which. As ever, if you're not sure on this, obviously read around it, you get on the Everlearner, get on Seneca, or speak to your member of staff, but I hope that helps.